I oversee a staff of about 1,300 people throughout the state of Illinois, doing a variety of different long-term care, education, employment. It goes, it's one of the very few agencies that cuts across every other agency, and I'm happy to be there. I just turned 31, so it is an incredible amount of responsibility, but it's not one that is not insurmountable, and that is why I'm pretty sure there's many veterans that are faced with the same barriers, and if given that proper opportunity, I am sure they will overcome as well. Thank you. Oh, and I decided, last year, that I should attend Northwestern and get a master's in public policy and actually use a post-9/11 GI Bill, because I had never used it. I said, why not? So
thanks for choosing Northwestern. Dr. Catherall?
My name's Don Catherall. I was a Marine infantryman in Vietnam in the late 60s. I came home shortly after the Tet Offensive of 1968 and started back to college in 1969, and it did not go well. For those of you who are old enough to remember, veterans sort of hid their veteran status in those years, and there was a lot of demonstrations on campus and that kind of thing. I lived in a little cabin out in the country with a shotgun next to my bed and had nightmares every night for a couple of years there. But I managed to come through all that, and the way I came through it, by and large, was by connecting with people and becoming part of the community of people back in this country again, which I still view as the most important single piece of making the transition from being a warrior back to being a civilian. I came to graduate school in Northwestern in 1978, and while I was in graduate school, the DSM, the Manual for Psychiatric Disorders, came out with the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, the trauma disorder. We had never had any kind of diagnosis like that before. The idea that war might be traumatizing to people somehow had escaped psychiatry up until that point. And being one of the only 2 combat veterans at Northwestern Hospital, I ended up working in that program that they got to treat veterans, which I did for a few years. My nightmares came back again while I was doing that. And so I left that and went to work at the Family Institute, which is now parked across the street here. This is when it was downtown. I started working with kids, which is what I had done in the 70s. And I ended up working with a bunch of traumatized kids, and once more, I found myself seeing the same thing I'd seen with the veterans. I saw families that were affected by what the individual had been through. And that became my defining interest throughout my career, is working with people who've been traumatized and the people who are in their support system, because everybody is affected by this. It is not just the individual. In the late 80s and 90s, I spent 5 years as a consultant to the Veterans Administration. I was on a national advisory committee that I went around and I site visited the PTSD units around the country and wrote white papers for the Secretary of Veterans Affairs and went to Washington and had lots of meetings and learned a great deal about what was going on across the country, about how people were approaching treatment of veterans and the differences, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. In a few minutes. Is that everything? That's enough.
Professor?
So I'm Peter Slevin. I've been teaching at Medill and some in Weinberg for the last few years, but as Paul said, I am an outsider, and what he didn't say was that I started this, developed this interest in the home front of the wars as an entirely clueless outsider. I didn't grow up in a military family. My father long ago served on a World War II destroyer, and he didn't talk about it very much. My experience growing up was Vietnam, living in Washington, where what you're most aware of was, Walter Cronkite on the evening news and the protest marches on the weekends. So my experience as a reporter was what first got me connected and interested in these issues. I ended up working for the Miami Herald and then for the Washington Post. My first experience with the military actually was more or less a peacetime operation called Operation Provide Comfort in northern Iraq after the first Iraq War, when the U.S. military almost literally swooped in and rescued hundreds of thousands of Kurds who were trapped in the mountains by the Turkish border, having fled there because they were afraid Saddam Hussein would come and get them. And I was awed by that. And then fast forward through the 90s, I was in Haiti, which also turned out to be a relatively peaceful operation. It was meant to be an invasion, and the Haitian junta backed down. So I saw the American military in operations then. And then I was covering foreign policy in 2002 and 3 and 4 and 5 for the Washington Post during the first during the Iraq War. Spent some time in Iraq with the military and seeing what the military did. And when I moved to Chicago for the Post in 2004, began to cover the home front of the Iraq and Afghan wars. Partly because I was interested in the intersection of politics and the real world, and seeing what the effects of political decisions were on actual people's lives. And I've found myself, in a way, almost developing a role as a translator between the military world, as so many of you know it, and know it so intensely, and the reading public in places like Washington, where, as you probably know, there is virtually no one in the House of Representatives or the Congress or the Senate, or at least before the Iraq War, who were making these decisions, who actually served in the military. And so just very briefly, a few of the things I worked on, probably the one that meant the most to me and taught me the most, I spent a year with a group of returning Marine reservists who had spent a year in Iraq, or 9 months in Iraq, in about 2005. They are this company of Marines based in Columbus, suffered the worst casualties of any company in the Iraq War. In a company of roughly 170 men, 22 were killed, and another 15 or 20 were injured. And I decided to focus on them after the parades were over, after they were back, to see what would happen. And the kinds of things that Don knows from personal experience were the kinds of things that over time these Marines shared with me, and ultimately stories that they wanted told. And it strikes me that, just as Don said, I mean, here it's 50 years after Vietnam and we're still talking about it, and you have 1.5 million warriors who have fought in one way or another, cycled through Iraq and Afghanistan. Those ripples will be rippling outward for as long as we're alive.
That's right.
And I think as a reporter and now teaching students, what I try to suggest to students is this is something you ought to know about. So thanks for having me on this.
Well, thank you everybody for sharing some personal insights, and I'll tell you, it's I think it's rather difficult to have a frank conversation about something if we can't trust that we can be personal. And so I really appreciate your personal stories, because they add value to what we're about to discuss. So before I get into the first question, I'd like to share a little bit about my background as well, partly because I can, and partly because I was asked to. So I too am Chicago born and raised, Northwest Side, St. Pat's High School, go Shamrocks. And when I graduated from high school, I went off to college at Southern Illinois University, and like most kids that go off to Southern Illinois University, I came back the next year. And so then I went to community college for a year. I went to Wright College, for a year, and traveled the country chasing a girl, and I caught her. And then I joined the military, and I signed up in mid-1994 in the delayed entry program, and then I went in 95, served 4 years on active duty as a medic, served in Korea, and when I got out, the first time I got out, I've now been in for 18 years. I have 12 years of active duty service, 15 years as an enlisted, and now 3 years as an officer. But when I got out the first time, it was difficult. Transition was difficult. I mean, that's what we're talking about. I had 2 children and one in a 9-month on the way, and our third child was on the way. We had no place to live. I hadn't finished college yet. Didn't have much job prospects, but I knew I didn't want to be in the Army anymore, but I didn't know what I was going to do. And you know what, I think many young soldiers coming out of the military, they're in the same boat. They're young, they're married, they've got a kid or two, they don't really have those prospects, they haven't finished their college yet, they've got a little bit here and there. While I was on active duty, I actually finished my associate's degree, but associate's degree doesn't go very far these days, So, I got involved in medical services. I tried climbing the ladder in that group, and fortunately, it was another veteran who looked out for me, one of my best friends since I was 5 years old, who looked out for me and said, "Hey, Paul, you know what? You should be doing something else. Why don't you come to my company and I'll see if I can get you a job." And he got me a good job, and it allowed us to be able to rent a good apartment. That job transitioned into a new job, and I climbed the ladder. I went from the dock, from line haul to the dock into sales for a transportation company, and I was able to buy a house. But I still hadn't finished my school yet because I was too busy trying to take care of my family, but I knew that was something that I had to do. And then along the way, that service kept calling me, that I needed to serve. I missed it. It was actually in 2001, in March, that I decided I wanted to go back in, and I